Hello guys, welcome to the final notes of the categories by Aristotle. And recently I just got a new mic, so if any issues with the mic, just let me know, or with the audio, just let me know. Alright, so to recap on the last part, which is part 2, we talked about the category of relation, quantity, and quality, right? And now we're gonna look at a term opposite, um, and this term can be used in several ways, and there are four primary ways things can be called opposites, which are correlatives, contraries, privatives versus positives, and affirmatives versus negatives. So correlatives. These pairs refer to things that are interdependent. For example, double and half are opposites, as double implies something is twice as much as half. And contraries, these are opposites in terms of qualities such as good and bad, white or black. Privatives versus positives. So this contrasts things like natural states, like blindness and sight, where blindness is the privative, lacking sight or the absence of sight, and sight is the positive, which is having sight, right? And affirmatives and negatives. So these refer to propositions. For example, when we take an example of an affirmation, he sits is opposed to a negation, he does not sit, right? And so the category of relation includes pairs of opposites that are defined in relation to one another. For example, double is explained as the double of something, and knowledge is explained as the knowledge of something. The concept of opposite in relation works by establishing a reference between two related terms. And some pairs of contraries are naturally present in a subject and must either contain one or the other, with no intermediate possible within them or between them. Sorry. And so examples can be like health and disease, where in animals a body must have either health or disease, not something between, right? And so odd and even, because in numbers, a number must either be odd or even. There's no such thing as a middle ground between that, right? However, some pairs of contraries do not require that either of the qualities be present, and they do allow for intermediates, like black and white is one example, because a body does not necessarily have to be either black or white. It can just be something like gray, which is between those colors, right? And good and bad is another example, because a person or thing doesn't have to necessarily be good or bad. It can just be something that's neither, right? And so these contraries allow for a range of intermediate states that lie between the two extremes. And these intermediate states can have specific names, like gray, and some are harder, like the intermediate between good and bad, which is not easily named, at least. And so moving on to privatives and positives, these refer to opposites where both terms refer to the same subject. For example, sight, which is the positive, and blindness, that is the privative, are both, or where both of these terms would refer to the eye as the subject. Each pair of opposites of this type has reference to the subject where the positive quality naturally exists. A subject is said to have suffered privation when it has lost the faculty or possession that it should naturally possess. And also, there's a very important note that I want you to take note of, that the states of possessing or being without a quality are not equivalent to the positive or privative terms themselves. And what I mean by this is that sight is a positive, but to possess sight is not the same as sight itself, right? Blindness is a privative, but to be blind is not the same thing as blindness. The opposition between possession and privation will also mirror the opposition between positive and privative qualities. Blindness is opposed to sight, thus being blind is opposed to having sight. Now let's talk about affirmation and denial. And so affirmation and denial are obviously opposites, and they have similar opposition to that of positives and privatives. So an affirmation is an affirmative proposition. For example, he sits. And remember that simple terms like sits is not a proposition. A proposition represents a truth value. A proposition is one that can be true or false, right? And denial is a negative proposition. For example, he does not sit. Then again, the fact that something is affirmed or denied is not the same thing as the affirmation or denial itself. In other words, the fact that something is true or false is different from the statement itself saying that it's true or false. The fact that someone is sitting is not the same as the sentence he sits. Similarly, the fact that someone is not sitting is not the same as the sentence he does not sit. Now, here a key distinction: fact versus statement. The fact is what is actually happening or true, it's the reality, it's the actuality. The statement is simply a way of describing or asserting the fact, or you can, in other words, say potentially. Right? And so Tony sits is not the same thing as the fact that Tony is actually sitting. The affirmation itself is not the same as the fact it describes. And so moving on, privatives and positives are not relative terms because in the case of relatives, there is always a reciprocal um, relationship, right? For example, in the relationship between father and son, the terms are relative because the existence of one necessarily entails the existence of the other. But in contrast, sight is not the sight of blindness, nor is blindness the um, the blindness of sight. There's no reciprocity between these privatives and positives. The relationship between privatives and positives is not going to be the same as contraries, right? Contraries and opposites contraries are opposites that either have no intermediate or have intermediates. Privatives and positives, however, do not even fit into the schema of contraries because you can also say that, well, either you're blind or you're not. There's no intermediate between either being blind or not, right? And so the privative blindness is not explained in terms of its opposite, which is sight. Um, Nor does blindness necessarily have a corresponding intermediate the way some contraries do. For example, gray is between black and white. And so remember, a positive refers to a natural possession of something that could be sight, hearing, right? The ability to speak. A privative refers to the absence of something that should naturally be present. And so privation only applies when something should naturally possess the quality, but it's not. And so not every lack of a quality is a privation, however. A rock is not called blind because it was never supposed to have sight in the first place. So then again, I spelled so wrong, but so then again, Aristotle argues that positives and privatives are not opposed in the same way as relational opposites because remember, relatives have their existence explained in reference to another thing, but sight can exist without blindness itself. Good can exist without evil itself, right? And so, why does positives and privatives uh, do not fit either type of contrary opposition, right? So unlike contraries with no intermediates, something can lack both the positive and the privative state. For example, a baby neither has sight nor is blind because blindness only applies when sight is naturally expected. Unlike contraries with intermediates, has once a privative state occurs, it is absolute. For example, if someone is blind, there is no intermediate state between seeing and being blind. Therefore, positives and privatives form a unique kind of opposition that is different from contraries. And so Aristotle uses inductive reasoning to show that the contrary of a good is often an evil. For example, the contrary of health is disease. The contrary of courage is cowardice. However, the contrary of an evil can be another evil, right? Defect, which is evil, has excess, which is another evil, as its opposite. While most opposites of evils are goods, some evils are opposed to other evils instead of goods. Also, it is not necessary that if one contrary exists, the other also must exist. If all people were healthy, then disease would not exist. If everything turned white, then black would not exist. However, for an individual subject, two contraries cannot exist simultaneously via LNC, which is known as the law of non-contradiction. And so contraries must exist in subjects that belong to the same species or genus. Health and disease require a body, white and black require a physical body. And so contraries must either belong to the same genus or belong to contrary genera or be themselves genera. So white and black belong to the same genus, which is color, right? Justice and injustice belong to contrary genera, which is virtue and vice. And good and evil are not part of a genus, but they are themselves a genera, categories under which other terms fall. Sorry. And so contraries can change into each other, which just means they have the potential to, do that. And so a person can go from healthy to sick and vice versa. A surface can go from white to black and vice versa. But they cannot be both healthy and sick or white and black at the same time, obviously for the sake of not, violating the law of non-contradiction. And so, however, in the case of privation, change is only one directional. Right. So, for example, a person who loses their sight, they can't just regain it. Right. A person who goes bald does not grow back their hair, assuming that they literally went bald 100%. A person who loses their teeth does not grow them again, and you could say except in childhood development. Right. And so, thus, privation is irreversible, whereas contraries allow reciprocal change between states. Right. So you can't just go from I mean, you can go from having sight to blindness, but you can't go back on that, right? Um, but you can go back in like healthy and disease, like the example above. And so, furthermore, Aristotle concludes that affirmation and negation form a separate category of opposition because one statement must always be true and the other always false. He sits is either true or false. That's LEM, law of excluded middle. Every proposition is either true or false. There is no middle ground between that. And he does not sit is the opposite and must be the other truth value. You can also call this the law of excluded middle. Between true and false statements, there is no intermediary. This is distinct from all other types of opposition. Because contraries do not require that one must always be true, primitives and positives allow for cases where neither state is present. Like again, an infant can be neither blind nor sighted. Aristotle says that in cases of contraries, correlatives, and positives and primitives, it is not necessary for one of them to be true and the other false, like blindness and truth. I mean, blindness and sight don't necessarily have to be true, right? And so, because truth and falsity only apply when there is a combination of words, right? A proposition and opposition and opposites by themselves do not form propositions, obviously, because if I just have a single term like blindness, um, there's no true value in that. It's just a term, right? Remember, statements form a proposition when they're combined into the judgment, right? And so health and disease are contraries, but neither is inherently true or false in themselves, right? Like the term double and half are correlatives, but neither is true or false in itself. So statements, propositions can be opposites, but their truth value depends on being or existence. Like, for example, Socrates is ill versus Socrates is well. These statements are obviously contraries, right? If Socrates exists, then one must be true and the other false. If Socrates does not exist, then both are false because neither condition applies to a non-existent subject. However, positives and primitives are different because Socrates has sight versus Socrates is blind, a case of possession and privation opposition. If Socrates does not exist, neither statement is true. Even if Socrates exists, it is not necessarily the case that one is true and the other false. If Socrates has not yet reached the stage where he is naturally capable of sight, both statements would be false. In affirmation and negation, truth and falsity are always going to be applicable. And so the opposition of affirmation and negation always results in one statement being true and the other false, whereas contraries, correlatives, and primitives do not necessarily involve truth and falsity. And so Aristotle identifies 5 distinct senses in which one thing may be said to be prior in another. To another, which are temporal, chronological priority, dependency or logical non-reversible sequence, order in structured systems, which is just logical or formal order, nature or moral priority, which is priority of value, causal is implication, priority, and mutual dependence. So for time, one thing is prior to another if it is older or more ancient. The terms older or more ancient inherently imply a greater length of time. And so for dependency or logical sequence, Aristotle uses the example of 1 and 2. If 2 exists, it implies that 1 must exist. However, if 1 exists, it does not necessarily mean 2 exists, right? And so for order in structured systems, the term prior is also employed to denote order within various systems or disciplines. In disciplines that use demonstration, like a logical method of proving, certain parts are logically prior to others. In geometry, the basic elements, akin to axioms, right, like Euclid's 5 postulates, are considered prior to the propositions derived from them. In language, in reading and writing, the letters of the alphabet are prior to the syllables they help form. In a worldview, metaphysics and epistemology is prior and make up a worldview. Oops. and natural or moral priority, there is a sense in which something that is better or more honorable is said to have natural priority, right? And so, for causal priority and mutual dependence, a fifth sense arises when two things are so interdependent that one is considered the cause of the other's truth. For example, consider the relationship between a man's existence and the proposition that he exists or he is. The fact that a man is leads to the truth of the proposition that he exists. The implication works both ways. If the man exists, then the statement he is must be true, and if that proposition is true, it does imply his existence. However, the truth of the proposition does not cause the man's being. Rather, the man's being underlies or causes the truth of the proposition, right? And so, furthermore, Aristotle explains simultaneous in several senses, which is simultaneous in time, nature, in the context of classification, and with the hierarchical exception of genera and species. And so simultaneous in time is when two things are simultaneous if their genesis or coming into being occurs at the same time. In this primary sense, neither thing is temporally like prior or posterior to the other. And so simultaneous in nature, simultaneous also applies when the being of each thing necessarily involves the being of the other, but neither is the cause of the other. The relationship between a double and a half, each exists in such a way that if one exists, the other must too, but however, one does not cause the other's existence. And so, simultaneous in the context of classification is that uh, within a given genus, species that are defined by the same method of division are considered simultaneous. For example, in the genus animal, the species winged, terrestrial, and water are defined by the same criterion of division, and none of these species is prior to or posterior to the others, because they are all simultaneous in nature. The hierarchical exception, which is genera and species, is that although species within the same genus are simultaneous, the the genus itself is prior to the species. If there is a species such as water animal, there must be an encompassing genus, namely animal. However, the existence of the genus does not necessarily imply the existence of any specific species. And so, Aristotle talks about the six types of movements. Aristotle identifies six distinct types of movement or change, and each referring to a different kind of transformation in the world. So, generation is the process of something coming into existence, being created or born. Destruction is the process of something ceasing to exist, being annihilated or perishing. Increase. This is the process of something growing or expanding in size. And diminution is the process of something decreasing or shrinking in size. And alteration is the process of something changing its qualities while remaining the same entity. And change of place is the movement of an object from one spatial location to another. All six kinds of movement are distinct, except for that one case where it might seem that alteration overlaps with the other five. The question arises, is alteration truly separate, or does it always involve another type of movement? Aristotle argues that alteration is, in fact, a distinct form of motion because it does not necessarily involve increase, diminution, or any other type of movement. When an object undergoes alteration, it does not necessarily grow or shrink, nor when an object undergoes increase, it does not necessarily experience alteration. And so a square that has a gnomon, which is a geometric addition, applied to it increases in size, but it doesn't alter its shape, right? Because remember, shape can also be quality or essential nature. This proves that increase and alteration are different processes. And generally, we would say rest is the opposite of motion, but specific forms of motion have their own unique opposites, such as destruction is the opposite of generation, diminution is the opposite of increase, rest in place is the opposite of change in place, and reverse motion, which is up versus down, is also a form of opposition. Aristotle states that for the type of motion left, alteration, it is not easy to define a direct opposite, but there are possible opposites such as an object remaining unchanged and change in the direction of a contrary quality like a object turning from white to black. Lastly, Aristotle talks about the term to have, also known as tener. I'm just kidding. Tener means to have in Spanish. And so the term to have refers to different types of possession or relation. Aristotle categorizes the different ways in which we use the term, right? And the term to have. One is to have as a habit, disposition, or quality. A person is said to have knowledge or virtue, meaning that the knowledge or virtue resides in them. This form of having refers to an internal possession of characteristics or mental states. Two, to have as a quantity. A person has a certain height. Excuse me. For example, he has a height of 4 cubits. This sense refers to a measurable attribute of an object or person. And thirdly, to have as possession of clothing or accessories. Someone is said to have a coat or tunic when they wear it. One may have a ring on their hand. This meaning refers to external belongings that a person wears or carries. 4. To have as a part of the body. So, a person is said to have a hand or a foot, and this refers to bodily possession, meaning something is naturally part of a being. And 5 is to have as containment. A jar is said to have wine. A corn measure is said to have wheat. In these cases, the term refers to the content held within a container. 6. To have as ownership or property. A person is said to have a house or a field. This refers to legal or practical ownership of objects or land. And 7 is to have as a relationship between people. A man is said to have a wife, and a wife is said to have a husband. This meaning is more abstract though, because it's referring to a social or marital relationship rather than literal possession. It shows cohabitation and a life's partnership, which is relationship rather than ownership. Also note that there is also other ways you can use the term to have and how it can refer to other things. And possession is not always going to be literal, and it can mean it can refer to qualities, relationships, etc., etc. And that's basically it for categories. And I leave this to you folks. Have a good night.